Welcome to our Nature is Medicine series, in which we explore and reflect on the healing aspects of nature. And my name is SYLWIA KIESZKOWSKA. I'm a psychologist, psychotherapist, and the creator of the Naturally Balanced platform. I have created the platform to share evidence-based knowledge about the impact of nature on the human mind and body. Today, I'm very honored to talk to Irina Feygina. Dr. Irina is a social psychologist who applies behavioral science to policy and program development and evaluation in areas of energy efficiency, clean technology adoption, environmental protection, sustainability, and climate change assessment and adaptation, as well as climate communication. I really wanted to talk to you, Irina. As an ecotherapist, I work a lot with the subject of climate. And I know that you also work as a coach and facilitator in that field. We also have a common training background, which is process-oriented psychology. Our expert community gathered around the project, the platform, consists of people who are activists in this field and also therapists, people who study and explore the impact of the natural environment on mental health and physical health. Thank you, Irina, for finding time today. I have prepared a couple of questions that we could talk about. So I wanted to ask you in the beginning, what role do you identify yourself with? Would you like to share a little bit about your journey that brought you to the point of connecting those two fields, psychology and climate?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and really glad to share what I can. This work is definitely my passion and my love. So it's also wonderful that you have brought a community together around this, because I think that's imperative, and really our path forward is to come together and build community and build relationships around this. So that's probably the most important thing. So I have these two two approaches that I take to working on climate change. One is from the training and the skills that I have as a social psychologist, and I study how people interact with institutions, with society, with ideologies, with different ways of doing things, with norms. And so then I think about how that plays out in the climate change space. And I've done all kinds of things. I started out studying climate change denial in the United States, where I live. I live in New York, in the US, although I'm originally from the former Soviet Union. And so I spent a lot of time really trying to understand where people are coming from, and how is it that we have an ever increasing amount of information about climate change, and yet our beliefs, people's beliefs and responses and intentions and energy are not aligning with what's needed for our survival. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that and understanding that it's really people's commitment to our social world and our ideologies and authorities that represent those that in a lot of ways take precedence over everything else. And so because of this kind of envelope of society that we're in and the beliefs that it espouses, we end up believing things and doing things that are actually not often in our best interest. And that we really have to think about our belonging to groups and to society first and foremost in order to understand human behavior. So basically, if you ever come across what looks like irrational behavior, like people not taking action on this existential threat, you have to ask yourself where are they, where's their allegiance? Where's their identity? Where do they feel they belong? And then when you see that, what groups are they part of, or what ideas are really shaping their reality? Then you'll understand where they're really coming from. So it's typically not irrationality. Typically it's because we're striving for inclusion and acceptance and love in the groups that we're part of, whether it's a small group like our family or institutions like places we work in or society as a whole. But in any case, that's often what drives our beliefs and our behaviors, often contrary to facts. Facts can't persuade us. Otherwise, if we have this desire to belong, fueling our decisions and our actions. So that's a really big thing that I learned as I was researching climate change denial. And then I've been doing a whole bunch of applied projects, working with policymakers and engineers and scientists and designers to create products that help to move climate change solutions forward. So a lot of communication so people understand what's happening, what kind of impacts they're going to experience. I was just mentioning sea level rise, weather changes, all that kind of stuff. So making sure that the scientific knowledge that's out there is translated into tools and information that people can actually make sense of and use. So that's been a really important thing. And then over time, I've witnessed how much conflict there is around climate change. And so as I started to train as a facilitator, that was one of my big aspirations, is to bring not only understanding of how humans are responding to climate change, but also tools for holding space for working through some of those conflicts, which arise in all kinds of settings within organizations, obviously between different groups in society, but also different groups that maybe have the same goals, but have different ideas about how to accomplish those goals. A lot of times, like when cities come together to create adaptation plans, there's a lot of tensions, there's a lot of complicated histories, there's power dynamics. So all those things are really central to work on climate change. And so as a facilitator, I've been trying to bring in that kind of awareness and hold those kinds of spaces and working around issues of water and adaptation and just community also, for people to have conversations with each other and be together while there's all of this really heated conflict in the background.
Wow, yeah. So I understand that understanding people's reactions is the first step, right? Trying to understand why they react the way they react.
Yes, absolutely. And where people are really coming from, what their experience of reality is, which I think we do, like for therapists, that's a very big part, right? Is really understanding what is the person's experience. It might look a certain way on the surface, but what are they really going through? And so I think in a way it's like doing that, but at a scale, not only of individuals, which also is very important, of course, but also groups and societies. Yeah. Organizations.
Yeah, it also, like, it's so complex, right? Because working with groups,
very complex.
Each individual might have a really different background and really different perspective. So, so those tools are universal.
Well, I think the tool of listening and understanding, trying to understand, is universal. I mean, I think, in process work, there's this idea of deep democracy, that we need to make space for everything it's in the room, even things that we don't like necessarily, but if they're present, if they're there, our unwillingness to look at them only makes the situation worse, because then those things, they're going to come in anyway, but they'll come in unwanted, unexpected, with animosity and defensiveness or whatever. So it's in our favor to really look at all of the pieces that are present. And so I think that applies to any situation. I think we can't fix many things, but we can be present to them with respect, and dignity. And I think, a lot, like, to give an example, a lot of some of this sounds kind of abstract. A lot of conversations about climate change become conversations about power differentials in society and the ways that the tremendous economic inequality that we have in our societies, but also the tremendous racial inequality that we have in our societies. And so sometimes you can't talk about the environment without talking about those things first. First of all, because they're all one entwined issue. But second of all, because climate change impacts disadvantaged people so much more, and also because the different roles that people have played and the fact that the power dynamics that give rise to racial inequality have also created the abuse of the environment. So you're really, these are not separate processes.
Right.
And so first of all, we have to acknowledge that, but we also have to acknowledge the different ways, the much more extreme ways that people who are already disadvantaged by our hierarchies are also more impacted, right, by climate change, and the ways in which people have been struggling with these detrimental processes long before climate change became evident. We now see it, but actually the dynamics have been at play for centuries, for as long as our society really has been, as we know it, has been around. And so a lot of times you really have to make space for all of those conversations, even though you may be aiming to, you know, talk about specific practical solutions to something that's happening in a certain space, but all of those elements are present in the room with you.
Yeah, so it seems like without this understanding, without this insight, it's really hard to work on change, right? Like psychology is this factor a little bit left out in some environments, but because it's so complex, right? The only approach, like from my perspective, is interdisciplinary, right?
Absolutely. Yes, no, I think you're right on. And it's definitely true that psychology has not been seen as a kind of player in the space of addressing climate change. That is changing it a lot, especially lately. And especially a really big reason why that's been changing is because people have realized that unless we understand human behavior, we're not going to be able to solve this. And a lot of times really good intentioned policy efforts and you know, money being put towards programs fails because people are not on board, because there's no buy-in, right? Because they haven't understood the users and their needs, because people are seeing things in an utterly different way than is expected. So I think the recognition for the need for a psychological perspective has come from the fact that ignoring people has really backfired. And so there's this sense of, okay, it's not working. We have to start looking at people. And actually, you know, I started doing this quite a while ago, and it was not a very popular thing to do. And a lot of times people would ask me, what does psychology have to do with the environment? Like completely sincerely, you know? And then I would say, well, because we are impacted by the environment and we impact the environment. And if it's deteriorating, it's because of our actions, and it's our decisions that will lead for that to stop. And once I would say that, people say, oh my God, that's obvious. But somehow the expectation, the sort of blueprint is that those were two separate worlds, social, economical, whatever, and ecological also were seen as these two separate realms. And I think a really big part of my work, I think, in the work of awareness, is to understand that no, these are all utterly intertwined realities. Our economies 100% depend on having healthy ecologies to be built on, having resources, right? Having human capital. So it has everything to do with human well-being, and people are nature. I mean, we have bodies, we have, you know, our life cycles, all of this is environment. And obviously if our environments are unhealthy, we have stand no chance of being healthy. And so somehow I think a really big spiritual, I think, part of this work is healing this ideological misguided sense that we are separate. This is separate from this, separate from this, and really just going through the process of embracing and a lot of times grieving how interconnected it all is. Yeah, I think that's really, in some way, that's the spiritual core, I think, of this work, is just connecting. And I've often found, like, I worked in the government for a while. You know, a lot of times in the government, people think of economics as the social science, really the only one that has any respect. And they think of behavioral science, they think of people as the wild card, this kind of unfortunate wild card that they have to deal with. Like, look, we designed this great program and then people go and misuse it and don't do what we expect, etc. So they saw it as something that is unruly, chaotic, not subject to, you know, any sort of understanding or influence. And so I think it's been, the effort has been to really say, no, this is a whole huge area of knowledge that we have about people. And if we take advantage of that knowledge, we have so much more resource to accomplish what we want to accomplish than if we treated it like this chaotic thing, you know. So a lot of it, I think a lot of what I do is just education around the fact that we do have inner processes. We know a lot about our inner processes. We have a lot of say in how our inner processes go. So let's use these tools. You know, it's a lot of that kind of bringing people into this different vision of things.
Yeah. So yeah, education, awareness, and inspiring sensitivity. Right. I'm really interested in those environments where you work and worked with. Probably there was, I imagine, not that much space for feelings, right? It's usually based on what I believe in, on science.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Definitely in the research space. I mean, there are people who research feelings and affect and try to understand that for sure. But I think overall, we do have, as in the West, there's this sort of striving towards being, I mean, I hate this word, but rational, like acting on well thought out. Again, it's very economical, right? Model of humans. Like we compared the costs and benefits and we decided on what the best way to go is, and now we're doing that or whatever. This almost never does this play out in practice when you look at the reality of how projects work. Yes, of course, you have to have goals, and you have to have structure, and you have to have timelines. I mean, all of these things are really important. You want to create a really good container for anything you do. But then there's all the experience that happens around it. So yeah, I agree with you. Feelings, and I would even say more than feelings, just human experience, you know, the lived process of these things. I can give you a couple of examples. One is I've worked on energy efficiency in buildings, and, you know, it's a really important area because I can't remember, up to 40% of our energy use comes from the built environment. So it's a lot. And there's, you know, a lot of knowledge about how to design buildings to facilitate all kinds of things and all of that. But what wasn't happening is we weren't looking at people who then inhabited these energy efficient buildings to see how are they doing, how are they experiencing them. I mean, this is where you spend like the vast majority of your life, right? Is inside either your home or your workplace. Well, now after COVID, things have changed, but this was before COVID, and these were retrofits. So they took old buildings and made them energy efficient. These were workplaces, and we went in to study how people are doing, and we discovered all kinds of fascinating things, like, you know, people's temperature needs varied tremendously. Like there was no one person that this building was being built for. The needs were so diverse. And then we discovered all kinds of really inventive ways that people would circumvent the energy efficient features if they weren't meeting their needs, you know. So like you really had to find out how people are doing, otherwise they were just going to make the building not work. And then there were things that they'd never thought about, like the sense of control that people have in their environment. Like they had these knobs to set the temperature previously before the retrofit, so you could actually control it locally. And then part of the retrofit was centralizing the heating, so you could no longer control it in your own office. But they didn't take the knobs off. They left the dials. And so people kept turning up or turning down the dials, trying to change the temperature, and it wasn't working because they were disconnected from the system. And it created this sense of powerlessness in them, and animosity and hatred for this space that used to be their space that they controlled, and now was controlled by some management person. They didn't even know how to call them and whatever. So once we discovered that, we could actually have a productive engagement with these issues, right? And try to make sure that we've got some kind of a back and forth, some kind of a dialogue going on between people, management, and building, you know, that we're all talking to each other. So that's one example. Another example, because I think it's a really great question you've asked. I've worked with a state level government organization on water issues. And, you know, it's a great organization, a lot of really talented, really skilled people. They have very diverse issues that they're dealing with in a state that has both drought and flooding and everything you can imagine around water, very complicated. So here's all these skilled people, but almost all of them are trained in, you know, engineering, science, a couple of ecologists, law, policy management, you know, couple of management people. But almost all their work, there's some people sitting in the background doing the research, but the vast majority of the people in this organization, with the state level organization, are dealing with people. They're either dealing with people in their own office, or they're dealing with people in the state that they serve. And very different people. Some people who are very powerful and have a lot of money and are using this resource. Some people who are really disempowered and maybe even houseless and are just struggling to get access to this resource. I mean, people coming from every possible direction to this issue. And that's what they have to hold every day as they do their job. And they have almost no training in this. They're hydraulic engineers, like they maybe had one class in anthropology or something because they had to take a social science class, right? And so many of them are intuitive people and they figure it out and they learn all kinds of ways to you know, connect with others and be really, you know, good at communication and inspiring, etc. But many struggle. And so I think that's a space where we can come in and legitimize the fact that, look, yeah, you're working with people now. That's the vast majority of your job. Like, and it's hard and it's confusing and people do really strange things. And it's okay to not know how to handle those situations. Let's actually sit with the difficulty, try out different tools, see what feels right, be creative. Share our learnings. That was always very popular when we would share our successes and what people learned and from failures as well. So it's almost like it's like creating the permission to bring in the human into places that are about this ecological climate stuff.
Right, and this is where psychology gives us tools, right, to hold this space, this diversity, both on the individual level and organizational level. So it really provides tools for transformation. And so I wanted to ask you specifically about process work, because this is very, very familiar to me. Obviously, deep democracy is really about honoring another perspective and creating space for it. Are there any other tools or experiences that helped you to understand and do what you do the way you do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, there's a lot of things to say about this. I think when we work with clients one-on-one, we have a lot more, well, it depends, of course, on the client and our relationship with them, but oftentimes we have a lot more latitude for using these tools in creative ways. We can work with the body, we can work with dreams, if people are open to it, we can work with relationships, we can work with histories, we can work with world events. There's all kinds of things, and they're wonderful. And I think, you know, the environment plays a huge role in how we can work with individuals, and we can talk more about that, of course. With organizations and groups, things get a little bit more complicated. You might have like an awesome group and people are so open and they've done a lot of their own inner work and they're looking to really like go deep and stuff. So awesome. Then, you know, you can use your whole toolbox. You can work on life myth, you know, you can work. But a lot of times I come into pretty mainstream settings where people have never really been exposed. Some people have not been exposed to these ideas. And my job, I feel, is to take those process work tools, get rid of all the stuff around it, and get to the core of what are we really trying to do. And I think at this point, what I feel is the core of what we're trying to do is listening. I think it's listening and building relationship. These are the sort of two things that I have really grown roots into. And then we have a lot of tools for both of those. And also those two things are completely intertwined, of course. But I think one of the things that I do a lot with groups is different ways of listening. So first of all, listening to yourself, and that's doing some very basic inner work. And a lot of times I use earth-based inner work, like finding a place on the earth that you love, and then feeling yourself there and connecting to it in different ways and discovering the energies there and all of that. That itself can be quite revolutionary for people because we typically don't leave space for inner work around here in the West. It's a very rare thing, actually. So just making that little place, and I tell people, we're just going to do this for 2 minutes. Don't worry, you know, if you don't like it, just sit it out or whatever. But it's an opportunity to have a little bit of time for yourself, which I think itself is a discovery. And then in terms of listening to others, I find role playing to be really important, because I think it's one thing to listen to somebody else through your lens, but it's another thing to become them to the extent that you can, and to actually take that in and then to try to come from that place. And you know, and it's energizing, and people typically have a really fun time with it, because especially if there's conflict, we're polarized, we're stuck on one side, and suddenly when you get to go to the other side, you know, it's kind of, there's like all this energy that's released. And a lot of times people find that they like being on the other side more. Like, for example, in this state level organization that I worked at, they had really hard jobs trying to get people to like engage in things that were necessary, but that the people really didn't want to do. And so when they went to the other side, they were like, I don't have to do anything, I'm free, you know, like they reconnected with their playfulness and their kind of, you know, like ability to question authority and all that kind of stuff. And then of course we can say, okay, well, how can we pick up that energy? How can you help the other side pick up some of your energy? You can pick up some of theirs. So you're loosening up the space a little bit, and you're allowing people to experience things in new ways and experience themselves in new ways. I think that's really the very important thing. That's a good tool. You know, for groups that are a little bit more open or advanced, I like to introduce this very core process work concept of working on a disturbance and finding things that they're really troubled by, and especially with climate change. There's a lot of things that we're disturbed by, so, and there's a lot of energy locked up in those things. So that can be a very powerful tool, and then helping people really step into that energy. That's the hardest part of that approach. Is because you can identify what troubles you, but to really extract the energy out of it is already hard. And then pick up the energy, like recognize that it's just energy, it's neutral. It's not about becoming that thing. It's about getting access to your own energy back. So, you know, that can be really good. And life myth work is wonderful, because I think a lot of people who work on environmental issues are, you know, dedicated, passionate people who have a calling, because it's really hard work. And at some point you start to burn out, and you start to feel like things are going too slow, and you're putting all your life energy into it and it's barely moving. And so I think in those situations, it's very important to reconnect to the myth, your own myth. What is it that ignited that fire in you? But also maybe the myth of the organization, or the myth of the movement, or whatever it is, you know, to really reconnect to the energy source.
Yeah, this is great. Such a great work that you're doing.
Yes. Yes. And that can be really fun. And people really, you know, they're amazing people. And I think part of the beauty of these exercises is not even, I mean, it's great that people kind of discover all of these things and see the other perspective. I mean, it's priceless, but also sometimes just that moment when people are like, oh, like, yeah, I'm amazing. I've been doing this really hard work and I have accomplished things completely against the odds. And I've built amazing relationships with others. And like, I think just those moments of like looking back at your myth and then seeing the trajectory of your work and seeing it in this from a little bit of perspective can just be so nourishing, you know. And I find that really really special, you know, to share that with people and to offer that to people. And then the last thing maybe I'll offer as far as working with groups using process work is that I have come into organizations that are not doing well internally, that have abuses of power. I mean, not like egregious things that they would get sued for or something. I mean, if that's happening, you need to then work in a legal setting and move to a different space. But just subtle things that like disrespect, you know, gossiping, you know, in Zoom meetings, in the chat, people saying something about somebody, you know, like just these small things which start to create an environment of distrust and animosity and fear. Like, I've worked in groups where people are so terrified to speak out loud. I haven't been able to engage anybody in responding to very basic questions. Usually when I give a little bit of a talk, I have questions in there to get people interested and engaged. Nobody will speak up. So for me, that's an immediate sign. Something is happening internally with this group. They're not only struggling with how to do outreach and whatever they're doing, but they're not okay as a community internally. And so then what I've done is I've actually pivoted my work with them towards working on their internal issues. And I don't know if this is process work in particular, it's just facilitation, but I will stop and reflect and frame what I'm seeing. Wow, I'm seeing that in this group, people are afraid to answer even really basic questions while we're all together in the Zoom meeting. Maybe we should explore what's going on, you know. And that's very, for a lot of groups, they've just never done that introspective work. It could be really novel for them, you know. And for a lot of managers, they might be aware that things are really, the morale is low, people aren't showing up for things, they don't feel good about their work, but they don't know what to do. And I think a lot of times they'll take like a management class and, you know, they'll learn some techniques and they'll try those techniques, and those are good things, but you actually have to work on the issue that has already developed in your group. You have to sit down and figure out, let's hear about it. Like, where's it hurting, you know, and let's sit with it. Let's first of all acknowledge that this is really painful. It's not okay. And we have to do something about it. And then, you know, try. So in a way, it is also an exercise in listening, but also in a kind of honesty where I come in as a facilitator. And even a lot of times I'm hired as a trainer, because that's the kind of thing that organizations have money for, and they have a need for their employees to keep growing, keep learning, which is really good. I come in as a trainer, but what I see is a need for a facilitator. And so then it's, how do I introduce that idea? It's kind of like a similar thing, like how to introduce behavior, the idea of working with behavior, with human stuff, and into these policy settings or program settings. Here it's like, how do we introduce facilitation into a setting that maybe is afraid to work on itself, doesn't even know that's possible, you know. And there's a lot of fears often, of course, around working on our own stuff, because that's where all the complexity is.
Yeah, and it can be mind-blowing for some people, I imagine, the realization that inner work can actually have an impact on some outer processes, not only in the organization, but also globally. And this is the whole essence, right? The whole beauty about combining those two fields. Right? The idea that by working on ourselves, we can introduce a change.
Yes, absolutely.
Bigger change.
Absolutely, yes. And to trust that, to trust that working on things, I think a lot of times the ethos is, don't go there. you know, because, well, and I understand people have to work together, right? They have to talk about very practical things and get stuff done. And if you raise all of the complicated emotional stuff and then you don't know how to deal with it, that's going to make that extremely difficult, you know? So I understand the trepidation around it, but of course that stuff simmers, and unless you're working on it, it's an issue for sure. So yes, I agree with you. It's like an opening. It's a possibility.
Yeah, which is very positive. I also wanted to ask you how psychology or social psychology can help us to respond to climate change.
Right. Right.
I also paid attention to you explaining that it's about listening mainly, and I had a small reflection here that this is actually our, you know, basic nature to have empathy and to listen.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Well,
yeah. Well, you know, you're reminding me. One of the really, really interesting learnings. Maybe I can share the story here that I had from that organization that I worked with. There were some really talented, wonderful people there, and they had a lot of experience. And there was this one guy who, this doesn't answer your question about social psychology, but because you raised this question of listening, I just thought of it.
It's kind of another question.
Yeah. He shared that they were working with groups of people who really weren't they didn't have a history of working with the government, and they were very resistant and very distrustful. That's what it was. It was a situation with a lot of distrust. And so this person came into this setting, and he was organizing various like public meetings where he was guiding people through like signing up for something, and it was a very complicated process. It was expensive. They didn't want to do whatever. It was very complicated. So they would go and they would do these trainings and trying to help people understand how to sign up and all of this kind of stuff. So one time he and his team showed up, and it takes a lot of work to organize these because they're far away and people don't want to come and whatever and all this stuff. So one time he organized one of these, and they got there and their equipment didn't work. Like they had PowerPoints and they had computers that people need to do stuff, and it just didn't work. And the technology, and so he was going to lose this audience. They like put so much effort into getting them into the room, and then they were just not going to stay. They were going to leave because the whole thing wasn't working. And so he just went out into the room while somebody was working on trying to fix the technology, and he started talking to people about stuff. And he's a really charismatic, you know, lovely person. He talked about his family and football and dogs and whatever, and people started chiming in. And these are people on different sides of the political spectrum, definitely at different sides about their beliefs about government and things, you know, very different. Anyway, but they were talking about other things, personal things, life, you know, kids and school and the cost of, you know, whatever, and all of that. And it took something like 40 minutes to fix the technology. It's a really long time. And so by then everybody was talking, and he had like shared all this stuff, and other people from the team had come into the room and started talking to the participants, the attendees. And by the time that the equipment was fixed, rather than doing their regular talk that they'd always done, they actually just sat back down and they listened. And they said, okay, well, we're already talking. Let's talk about this thing that we've brought to you. And it ended up completely shifting their whole approach, because first of all, they learned a ton of things from these people about why the process wasn't working and what needed to be fixed and all of that. But then they also realized that they have to first come in and listen. And only then can they bring the stuff that they're coming in with, because first they have to build trust. Because if it's being delivered without trust there, it's just never going to be received. It's pointless. And so they started doing it in this very new way, and they would first listen and have dialogue and whatever. And then eventually if people were open, they would bring in all the technical stuff. And they ended up building such a strong relationship that then this whole community would go to this office in this larger state level organization when they needed to deal with other offices. And they would say, all right, well, we trust you, help us navigate this other thing that we have to now deal with, you know? And so they became kind of the middle person, the middle people in a situation of distrust, larger situation of distrust, you know? And yeah, and that's it, you know, that's something they figured out on their own. And but I think it's so insightful in terms of using all of these tools that are available to us: listening, relationship building, you know, caring about where people are coming from, understanding about identities and belonging, right? Understanding the role of human connection, just all of it. It's like they kind of created a tool that takes advantage of sort of everything in the toolbox, you know? So yeah, so that's a really interesting example. So that's kind of on that interpersonal level, but on other levels, in terms of social psychology, it can be applied in so many ways. Essentially, with almost everything, there's a in the climate change space, there's, you know, there's the science, there's the programs that are being developed, and then there is their implementation. And so throughout the whole process, there's a sort of intended audience who will either be using the product or engaging in a program or in some other way participating with what's being created, right? And so the first thing to do is to understand the people. And I think that piece is often missing, like actually going out there, talking, sitting with it, maybe doing surveys if you can't talk to people. And it's labor intensive, and it asks a lot of the creator. But if you haven't done that work, you're creating a product that doesn't serve the needs that you're creating it for. And so it's kind of doomed often to failure. So the first piece is acknowledging that there's an end user there, or many different kinds of end users typically, and really being intentional about understanding who are they, what do they need, where are they coming from, what is this all about for them, etc. That's the first piece. And then in psychology, we have many tools for learning that information, right? And connecting with those people. We have, you know, we have all the survey and interview tools, but then we have all the listening tools we've been talking about, right? So all of that. And we also have lots of background research that tells us about people. So that's one piece. But then as you develop something, you again always have to be aware of the user, and you can pilot test your stuff, and you can go out there and see how it works and what are people's reactions, and use that feedback to inform your development. It's this iterative process, you know, and then of course, when you're done, you can evaluate it and see if it's working. So that's sort of the development process and how psychology comes into it. But then also there's, of course, creating the communication around it. Do we do one directional communication or bi-directional communication? You know, how do we engage people? How do we create an experience for them that they're going to actually be drawn to? How do we, right? Because people have really limited attentional resources. So how do we make sure that they have the resources necessary to actually engage in our, whatever it is, program, product, process, activist movement, whatever. And it's then seeing how are people impacted, and coming back to what you're talking about, how are they feeling? Are they in a place of grief about all of this? Are they feeling disempowered? If they're feeling disempowered, what can we offer them to engage them? Like, you have to really work with people's experience. Or if they don't trust us, or they don't believe us, if they don't think this thing is happening, then what is it that they're trusting in? Where are they coming from? And how can we speak to that instead of trying to bang down a closed door, right? So really understanding how people work. And then the other, I think, really important tool that we have has to do with norms, our beliefs about how our group thinks things should be done, how they are done and how they should be done, our descriptive norms and prescriptive norms. And the vast majority of human behavioral change happens because of norms. Yes, sometimes we come to people and we persuade them, have to do this because this or that. Of course, that happens. But so much of change happens because your environment changes and the people around you start doing things a little differently, and you adjust. And it's not as painful. Change can be really painful, but when everything around you has changed and you changed with it, and you still fit in, and you still feel accepted, and you still feel good, and we did it together, and we maybe also had a party while we were doing it or whatever, it's not such a bad thing. It's like, it feels more like growth than change, right? And so I think a lot of times without that understanding, we come in and we say, okay, we have to get this thing to change, instead of saying, all right, let's facilitate the change process. Let's make sure all the pieces change together in a way that sort of makes sense. And then then you're opening the door for people to shift their behavior. So it's really, it's a little bit of a mindset difference in how to approach the whole notion of change.
Yeah, it's so complex and so diverse, but hearing about all those tools, it makes me very hopeful. Yeah, thank you so much, Irina, for doing what you're doing and for sharing.
Sure, you're very welcome.
About this. This is really inspiring to me. I'm sure it will be for other people as well.
My pleasure. Thanks for making a space for this. I think the more we can, share what's been working for us, is the more we can, help each other really bring good things in this space. Yeah.
Thank you. And for the listeners, I wanted to say that if you liked our conversation, share it, like it, subscribe to it, so more people can get inspired by what we talk about. All right. Thank you.
You're so welcome.